This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. Today we're digging into the real story behind one of the most mythologized and misunderstood eras in American history, the psychedelic 60s. My guest is Susannah Cahalan, whose new book is The Acid Queen, a biography of Rosemary Woodruff Leary, muse, fugitive, and definitely indicted co-conspirator of Timothy Leary's psychedelic revolution. We talk about hippie communes, outlaw drug smuggling, the war on drugs, and how the counterculture at its best moments ran experiments in radical individualism where personal freedoms were used to build voluntary communities founded on altered consciousness and aesthetic liberation. The Acid Queen helps explain how the personal became the political and why libertarians should care about the messy legacy of the counterculture. This conversation was recorded at a live event in New York City. Go to reason.com/events to get information about the next one. Here is the Reason interview with Susannah Cahalan. Susannah Cahalan, thanks for talking to Reason at the Psychedelic Assembly.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here, and especially at a place that Rosemary would have loved so much.
Yeah, this has her vibe all over it.
Absolutely.
Why don't you very briefly tell us who Rosemary Woodruff Leary is?
Sure.
Was.
So Rosemary Woodruff Leary, as much as I hate to start with Timothy Leary, we are starting with him. She was the third or fourth wife, depending on who you ask, and how seriously you take divorce records from Mexico.
Yeah.
She was a seeker. She was someone who was a behind-the-scenes character who was propping up Timothy Leary, working with him behind the scenes on his speeches, sewing his clothing, really helping him create an image. And she was also very much a true believer in the role that psychedelics could play in not only expanding consciousness, but actually making society better.
Right.
She was called the Queen of Set and Setting.
Yeah. Explain what set and setting
Yes.
is. And, because when you're talking about Timothy Leary and set and setting, that carries a wallop. Explain that for us.
It does. So and one of my favorite things that Timothy Leary wrote about, this is pre-Rosemary, was the concept of set and setting. And, I'm going to reduce it very much down to its essence, but it's the mindset that you bring into a trip, and it's the environment. And Rosemary was very good at making people feel grounded and supported. And she was very good at beautifying spaces. She knew what colors to make the throw pillows, to position people properly, to make sure they kind of channeled and augmented their trips. And that's why she earned that moniker.
And, Leary was born in the early 20s. She was born in 1935 in California and then ended up in New York.
She was born in St. Louis.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
In St. Louis. Then she is in California at some point,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
yes.
And then in any case, she shows up kind of at the end of the beatnik scene or the beat scene in New York. What was going on there? Like, who was she? Because we'll get to how she meets Leary and how they kind of become the king and queen of Millbrook, the upstate estate where where Timothy Leary and Richard Albert, who became Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner really created the text that started the 60s version of psychedelia. But what was she doing in New York?
So she was born in 1935, as you said, from St. Louis, high school dropout, very beautiful. Was in an abusive marriage at 17 and left that after she lost a baby, and boarded a train to New York and with no money in her pocket and no degree, and was recruited and spotted by Eileen Ford and began modeling.
Of Ford model.
Ford model fame. And she then she did like the second sexiest occupation that you can do, which is airline stewardess at the time, which was apparently harder to get in than Harvard. You had to be less than 120 pounds, XYZ. And so she fit the bill. And there she met her second husband, who was a jazz accordionist. A Holocaust survivor.
She knows how to pick them. Right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. He was an intense guy, I've heard. I did not meet him myself, but I interviewed several people who said he really kind of, everyone knew that he didn't take anyone's shit, and people really respected him for him, especially Miles Davis, who was a big fan of his. And interestingly, I've actually listened to his work. You can find Matt Matthews on Apple Music, I think. And it's really good. It's like
wow.
shockingly good jazz accordion. But so she met him and married him, and was instantly kind of involved in the jazz scene that was going on in the mid '50s in New York City, and began rubbing shoulders with the beatnik scene as well, the early beatnik scene with Jack Kerouac, and kind of rubbing shoulders with these kind of, interesting writers and artists and kind of, scoundrels of the era. And that's when she started really experimenting with drugs.
What drove her to that? Because it's a fascinating demi-monde, which definitely gives rise to, the East Coast version of the 60s counterculture. What was she seeking that she wasn't getting in St. Louis?
Oh, I think it's such a great question. I think she had always talked about herself in these kind of mythic terms. She saw herself as someone who's going to live a great life, and like with the capital G, great. And she wasn't going to find that in her small town in St. Louis is a city, but she wasn't going to find that there. And she was attracted to great men, as she liked to think of them, these genius archetypes. And that's what she found in New York. And through being in this scene and being a part of the music scene, and even though she wasn't a musician, she wasn't necessarily an artist outright, she was able to express some of those sides of herself and express some of these, these great parts of herself through the men that she picked.
What if one day you could change how you think, how you lead, and how you shape your future? Join Reliance College for Reliance Day on Saturday, June 28th in Los Angeles. This one-day high-impact experience is designed for students, professionals, and lifelong learners ready to level up their thinking in an AI-driven world. At Reliance Day, you'll dive into collaborative Socratic discussions and sharpen the critical thinking and leadership skills that drive success in college, business, and life. It's a full day of intellectual challenge and creative exploration, rooted in the great books and Montessori-inspired methods that have transformed over 400 lives. Go to reliancecollege.org/Reliance Days to register. That's reliancecollege.org/Reliance Days. They can't wait to see you on Saturday, June 28th. Let's talk about how she meets Leary and ends up moving to Millbrook, the upstate estate where Leary and his peers kind of repaired to after getting bounced from Harvard in the mid-'60s. Yeah. How did she meet him, and then how did she come to live in Millbrook?
So she took a little bit of LSD before she went to a gallery opening in downtown, and there she saw kind of the man of the hour, which was Timothy Leary, and they were kind of fresh off the psychedelic experience. It was the book, The Psychedelic Experience, which was a seminal guide that is quoted in a famous Beatles song, Tomorrow Never Knows.
Right.
And he was really, pontificating and really enjoying the spotlight there. And they both were immediately attracted to each other. Right. They both write independently of the kind of immediate pull. And she was intrigued, but she was divorced again and dating another jazz musician who was very abusive. But she was in love with him. And so at that time, she didn't decide she wanted to go with Leary. It was later when she decided to go with her friends to visit Millbrook, because Millbrook, for people who don't know, is a 2,000-acre, rich estate, wealthy landowner, old school estate in Millbrook, in a very kind of a very fancy suburb in upstate New York. And, this is a place that has about 12 buildings, including an indoor tennis court and a bowling alley on the grounds. And Timothy Leary was dating briefly the sister of two brothers who owned that estate. And through her, she was an amazing woman named Peggy Hitchcock. And she managed to secure that house for $1 a month for Timothy Leary and his fellow ex-Harvard psychologists.
Who eventually created something called the League of Spiritual Discovery.
Which I'm wearing the necklace from that.
And I mean, that is really, if there is a place where what we think about when we think about the psychedelic 60s, where it comes from, it's that.
Absolutely. It's, the experiments weren't just psychedelic in nature, but they obviously did experiment very heavily with, using psychedelics, using them in high doses, using them over long periods of time, using them with a person solo, all sorts of different psychological experiments that Timothy was bringing from his time in Harvard, and before that working on interpersonal dynamics. So there they would not only do that, but they would also kind of experiment with your food, dyeing the eggs green and just trying to get you out of the stultifying present and really become aware of your surroundings. And a gong would bang. They were constantly taking, at that point you had to go to your journal and, present how aware you were by writing it down. And it became this exercise, like a Gurdjieff kind of exercise in awakening and being very present.
Can you set the scene a little bit for what was going on in post-war America, where this type of thing was even taking place and then was about to burst out into everyday culture? Were people feeling repressed? Were they feeling stultified? Why? And then why were they ready to, okay, I'm going to go to this crazy place upstate and take a bunch of drugs and eat green eggs?
Yeah, I know it's an interesting time that I think there's a lot of overlap with today, but it was, coming out of 1950s America, coming out of the, immediately after the atomic bomb, there was a lot of sense of insecurity, and some people responded to that insecurity and fear by kind of doubling down, having a lot of children, being very family focused, and other people started questioning the nature of their reality, where, the role of society. And it was the same time that you have the rise, this kind of vast intellectualization that was happening in America, where you have cheap paperbacks and foreign translations and art house cinema. All these things were happening at that time, really, and that was really the beatnik movement. And the next kind of step was, how do we apply this not only to this little world in our beatnik world, but to society? And psychedelics seem to be one of the ways people were exploring, how do we change our consciousness and thus the rest of the world?
And I suspect some people in the audience get a sense of this too when you talk about, okay, so they're tripping and then a gong sounds and they write in their journal and they eat food, food that has dyed weird colors. There is a dimension to Millbrook where it is, it's either the greatest thing ever or it's the beginning of, the People's Temple.
Like a bad
with
movie.
Jim Jones or something, right?
Exactly.
Talk about how did it kind of go in and out of that kind of focus?
Well, it was both, like all things, like many things are. It was Nina Grabowy, who was a female psychonaut of that era, a little bit older than the rest, kind of like was a mother figure. She said that Millbrook had many faces, and I think that's very true. And I think it did change. A lot of time women had a very different experience than men did there. But, I think in some ways, yes, like this idea of expanding consciousness. And they really did believe. I think there was authentic belief there. They're trying vegetarianism, they're communal child rearing, all sorts of these different ways of building a new society, because they felt that the society as it was stuck and was, retrograde, or whatever word you want to use. It was not. It was regressive. It was, stultifying, all the words. But, I think that this was an opportunity for them. So there's that side. But then, the old social hierarchies were still observed in the house. There was, really kind of very human-based behavior that occurred. And women were oftentimes still left. Peggy Hitchcock actually had a great line where she said, at the end of the revolution, there was always the question, who's going to do the dishes? Right. And at the end of the day, the women were going to do the dishes. And they were still kind of caught up. And, Rosemary described how Timothy, despite all of his talk of revolution of the mind and we're going to upend society, was the kind of man who put his hand out and expected to have a martini glass put in it. So.
And part of the function that she served was to do that. She kept the rooms clean, or organized the feeding of, hundreds of people sometimes.
Yes. And, it's funny because it's been an interesting thing talking about Rosemary in today's culture, where women, there seems to be this idea of like either this trad wife, you have to be a trad wife, or you're a girl boss. And she wasn't either of those. Right. Yes, she was stuck with the position that oftentimes she resented, but she actually did really enjoy taking care of other people. That was a genuine thing, and she was really good at it. Yeah. She was genuinely really good at taking care of people and beautifying spaces too.
Yeah, and that, it's interesting. After reading this book, I caught a recent documentary about Anita Pallenberg, the model and actress who ended up married to Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones for a while, and it talked about how much she added first to Brian Jones's look and then to the Stones more broadly. And it's kind of fascinating. Like, we tend to overlook the accessorizing of the revolution, cultural revolution. Can you talk, where did Rosemary's sense of taste come from?
Oh, that's such a great question.
Because she wasn't educated in any of this.
She wasn't
stuff,
educated.
right?
Her mother did so, and I think, according to her brother, who was very wonderful in helping me put this together, I think she had a great eye. Maybe that's something she was born with. She had a pull towards, things that were unusual and exciting, and her eye caught those things. I mean, even just the men she picked, but the clothing she wore, there was always something that was beautifully done. She never, indulged in the tie-dye or the kind of like, the cliche. She always it always was interesting and exciting, and it could actually, if she wore it today, you would be like, oh, she's a very well-dressed woman. So there's something kind of classic and exciting in the way that she styled herself, and she extended that to Timothy as well in the styling of his look.
You do an extended reading of a famous photo of John Lennon and Yoko Ono singing in Toronto in their bed, and Timothy Leary is there, and so is Rosemary. And it is amazing when you look at all of these people, most of whom are in kind of period drag, right?
Yes.
Where they're like very much of the time and the place. And then you look at Rosemary, who is kind of in the center of the photo, but looking slightly off. She looks incredibly contemporary.
It's so funny that you say that. That photo, I think there were a few things that made me realize I really wanted to do this book. And that photo was one of them, not just because it's John and Yoko in the famous bed in the white, and there she is, and you never noticed her before. Your eyes kind of glance past her, but she's looking at you, the viewer. I mean, she's looking directly at the camera. And there is this sense that she's out of time, almost like she's photoshopped in. And of course she's not, but she does give that impression. And I think maybe there's something about her style and her sensibility that was a little bit out of time.
So she also was up for just about anything, because after a short period at Millbrook, describe what happens when she and Tim Leary and Leary's kids start traveling. And very quickly they become literal outlaws.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the law was down their neck from like 6 months into their relationship. I mean, they got arrested at the Laredo border, bringing marijuana into Mexico, right at the beginning of their relationship. Not wise.
So strange.
Not wise.
Yeah.
I love the list of I had a list of what they confiscated, and they were like obsessed with the brown flour, like the the brown bread flour. Like, who has this wheat flour?
Right.
What sort of thing is this? So but it wasn't a good idea to bring the little amount of marijuana that they did, and so that was the first time. And unfortunately, the marijuana was found in Timothy Leary's daughter Susan's underwear. She was hiding it, and that did not look good for anyone involved. So that was the first, and that was, I think, 5-6 months into their relationship. Right. So from the beginning, the law was after them. And then there was raid after raid of Millbrook, led at one point by G. Gordon Liddy, who was one of the plumbers, Nixon's Watergate.
And would eventually do a college tour with Leary in the 80s and early 90s.
It's wild. Yeah. That stuff is wild. But so that was always a part of their relationship. Like, I think the first 5 months were this, she'd really see as many first 5 months of any relationship, but especially for her, it was idyllic because they didn't have the threat of, incarceration constantly down. Chasing them. And there was another arrest in California. Millbrook was a failed experiment ultimately. And the very wealthy brothers who owned it didn't want the issues related to dealing with the kind of vagrants who were going on the property.
What went into the failure of the Millbrook experiment? Yeah. I mean, part of it was they were constantly being surveilled by police. But, that's not the whole story.
No.
Why did it not work?
So much pettiness, lots of infighting. There was an ashram on the grounds. There was a League for Spiritual Discovery, which was Leary's religion that he incorporated. And there was just competing personalities, egos, lots of inflated egos that were, which can be a byproduct of excessive use of psychedelics.
And people take psychedelics to dissolve their ego.
Right.
But somehow,
sometimes the alternate.
Yeah, it's more like one of those sponges that grows when watered, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it can be, it can go in any direction. Amplification, of various things can happen with psychedelics. Right. And in the case of a lot of these dudes who were hanging around Millbrook, there was a lot of amplification of ego. And so it was just there was a lot of fighting, and it was expensive. Even though it was only $1 a year, Leary still had to work on feeding everyone.
Right.
You know, I think at one point he was paying for everyone's doctor's bills, and there was a lot of STDs being going around at that time. So there were a lot of doctor's bills. So there's just like the humanity in tight spaces, even though it wasn't a tight space. Still, you still have those issues that you're trying to escape.
Where do Rosemary and Timothy end up escaping to most famously?
So they end up in California, where you would expect them to, and they end up under the auspices of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Fascinating group, a wonderful name, of a kind of, they're described as, Rolling Stone, I think, described them as a hippie mafia. They were surfers who used hollowed out surfboards to transport their heroin basically from Afghanistan and hash from Afghanistan, and all sorts of drug smuggling operations in Mexico.
And their dream ultimately was they were using, by their lights, they were using their drug smuggling operation to fund a plan to dose the world,
turn on the world, put it in the water supply.
Yeah,
that was the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
They got pretty close. They had some pretty amazing chemists working for them, and they were able to get about several million doses ready for that. And Rosemary and Timothy ended up under their care, and they were really taken care of because Timothy's psychedelic experience and his book, How to Start a Religion, were key cornerstone texts for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. The head of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a guy who passed away from apparently an overdose of psilocybin, which I think may be impossible, but that was the official coroner's report. But he was a real devotee of Timothy Leary, and really a believer, another real believer as well. And I mean, they did things like laundry Timothy Leary and Rosemary's silk robes. Like they take them to the dry cleaner and make sure that they were properly taken care of. They put them up in beautiful homes and really took care of the couple as royalty. But the law came for Timothy and Rosemary there as well. And they were arrested in Laguna. That was their second major drug bust.
And Leary ends up going to prison, right?
Yes.
And the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and Rosemary is involved in this, decides to break him out of jail.
Yes.
Can you describe how that happened and what was Rosemary's role?
A wild story. I mean, he was given, at the time, I think it's important to say he was running for governor against Ronald Reagan of California.
Right. And his slogan was "Come Together," which
Rosemary came up with.
Yeah. There's
"Come Together, Join the Party."
And there's confusion or debate over whether or not Tim Leary was involved in the John Lennon Beatles song.
Well, he was. It was definitely.
Right. But I mean, they ended up arguing over it.
I'm sure they did, yeah.
But it's Rosemary's slogan.
Rosemary's slogan. And John Lennon was supposed to write the campaign's song, but he got arrested before that was ever a thing, and he just wrote a real song.
Right.
But Timothy Leary was sentenced Laredo was this very long legal saga, ended up going to appeal, and then it was retried. He gets convicted there. He gets convicted in Laguna, and in total, he's facing 30 years in prison for marijuana possession.
And of tiny amounts.
And not a lot of amounts at all. I mean, probably could fit in your hand. Right. So, and there was LSD, but it wasn't illegal yet. And Rosemary's Ritalin as well, which was also not illegal. But he was a political enemy, and he became a kind of figure. It was interesting because before he was imprisoned, he was kind of a bit of a joke in the counterculture. He was a lot older than the youth revolt happening on the New Left, and he was seen as kind of out of touch. And then when he went to prison, he became a bit of a martyr, and the kind of New Left rallied around him and managed to work with a very famous lawyer named Michael Kennedy and with Rosemary to orchestrate an escape. And that involved Timothy preparing himself. He was, according to lore, and I believe this, I think this has been well documented, but Timothy is a trickster, so you always have to doubt. But he had come up with a personality assessment before his foray into psychedelics when he was at Kaiser in California.
He was a psychologist working for Kaiser Health.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. Doing a lot of work on personality and interpersonal dynamics. And he apparently came up with something called the Leary Circle. And it basically shows how you will act in a relationship with another person. Will you be an aggressor? Will you act as a victim? And apparently that test was used on him.
Right.
in the jail, and he managed to convince the authorities that he was not a threat, and they gave him a very kind of Tony Cush, low security prison in California called CMC West, and apparently a lot of older inmates would end up there, and allowed him the opportunity to climb, I think, a very long pole and go across barbed wire, a very cinematic escape. Yeah. But Rosemary was the one who was facilitating all this. So she was carrying messages, which it was amazing because I got to see letters that were never seen before that were used by the FBI to decode this later. And they spoke in all these different code words. And I got to see those letters, which was really exciting, and see the real kind of role she played in this escape. And she worked with the Weather Underground and eventually the Black Panthers. In
how did she feel about going underground? Because in a way, this is the ultimate adventure, especially if you're, kind of pinning your future to, a great man who, of course, is going to be attacked because mere normal people can't really appreciate him. But how did she feel about all that?
That was really a line in the sand for her. At that time, she had, before his arrest, she was begging him to kind of walk away from the limelight and start a family. And they were trying to start a family, and she couldn't conceive. But she really wanted to, she had gotten so close to fame and seen what it was really about. And I think she found it pretty repulsive. And she wanted to get away from it. But when he was in prison, she became the face. That was when she got her moniker from Allen Ginsberg, the Acid Queen. And so she became the person who took every media interview. And when she decided to finally throw her hat in with the revolutionaries and do this extremely illegal act that would make sure that she probably wouldn't come back to the United States, she knew she was erasing herself at that point. She knew that was going to be a line that once crossing it, you couldn't uncross it. And I think that she has this, in her diary, she writes about how she had this image of all the lives she could have had this not happened. And it was simple things like walking to the library or going, working. She saw herself working at a bakery, and all these different things, paths in her life that could have happened, ended.
But she does, she helps facilitate, connections from the Brotherhood of Eternal Love to the Weather Underground. Leary gets out and they go to Algeria, where they hang out with the Black Panther Party in exile, headed by Eldridge Cleaver. What is that like?
Unhappy cohabitation, to say the least. Leary was still very out of touch. He didn't have his hearing aids. He wore hearing aids. And there was a kind of conspiratorial vibe to the Panther International headquarters because Algeria was kind of uncomfortable with them being there. Algeria was also working on a kind of deal with the U.S. on the sidelines. They picked Algeria because there wasn't an extradition treaty. But it was an uncomfortable place for Eldridge Cleaver, and he was obviously we know from, the FBI work that he was being targeted and that there were a lot of undercover kind of agents and narcs.
Well, this is the weird thing about the counterculture, right? Is that fully half of the people
100%
at any place were government agents, right?
I have the FBI files, the Leary FBI files. And when I say that every page is redacted, every page is redacted. I remember reading, I think it was like 40% of the Black Panthers were undercover agents. And so he had reason to be paranoid, let's say that. But he was very paranoid.
And Cleaver was kind of, however he ended his life, this was arguably among his very worst moments. And the Panther Party also replicated the gender dynamics in an even more extreme form than what you might have seen at Millbrook.
Absolutely. So his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, was, Anita Hoffman was there, who was married to Abby Hoffman, and she really was disgusted by the rampant misogyny going on that she witnessed, that she actually escaped out of a bathroom window and returned to her husband, Abby, who was also on the lam in Paris. It was not a happy place for the Learys. The Panthers did not believe in psychedelics or LSD, especially not Eldridge Cleaver. He had had bad experiences with LSD. And, Leary just couldn't wrap his head around the fact that it wasn't his playground. And he and Rosemary would go off in the sand dunes and run around naked. It was a Muslim majority country. This is not appropriate. And
that had a Marxist revolutionary government
exactly,
at the
with
time.
French occupation, and occupation was seen as drugs were seen as a tool of occupation. It was just a nightmare. And so Eldridge and company actually kidnap Rosemary and Timothy and hold them hostage for a week or so.
Did they also get them? And this is, Rosemary's life is interesting, partly because she goes along and then ends up in weird situations. But at a certain point in Algeria, Leary, who had always been kind of beyond politics,
Yes.
he would be the last person you would expect to endorse this or that candidate, because he always said these were all just menopausal men who needed Geritol and, were killing other people because
you should only talk politics unless you're on all fours.
Yeah. But then he gives a very political speech, right, at the behest of the Panthers.
Yes.
What is that about?
It is a sort of, Rosemary talks about this. Rosemary was actually, I think that she was radicalized before actually getting to the Panthers when she was with the Weather Underground. Mm-hmm. She was with Bernardine Dorn, and she really liked Bernardine Dorn and really respected her and really kind of respected what she was saying about women. And she, at one point, even thought about leaving Leary to join the Weather Underground. But when she called them...
I'm not sure that would have ended better.
No,
right?
I don't think so. When she called them... They, from when she was underground at that point, and she was in Paris before they went to Algeria, and they asked her, "Can you type?" Mm. That was the one question they had for her, and she thought, that was the exact job I was escaping in St. Louis. I'm not going to do it for the Weather Underground. So she ended up going to Algeria, and reunited with Leary and the Black Panthers, which ended badly, obviously.
Before we continue with the recent interview, I want to tell you about the Future of Freedom podcast. If you're tired of cable news debates and Twitter shouting matches, and you're looking for serious, good faith conversations between people who actually care about liberty, then it's time to check out the Future of Freedom podcast. Each episode dives deep into a single topic: tariffs, campus speech, Doge, and it brings together two guests who disagree on the best way forward. But here's the twist. This is not a debate show. There's no interrupting and there's no dunking. Each guest, whether libertarian or conservative, has to make their own case, not just tear down the other side. It's compelling, it's civil, it's genuinely challenging. You'll hear familiar reasoned voices like me, Stephanie Slade, and Joe Lancaster on it, alongside other principled thinkers on the right and center right, each bringing sharp ideas to the table. So if you believe the future of freedom depends on more than just winning arguments, and you're ready for something deeper than the usual echo chambers, check out the Future of Freedom podcast. Real disagreement, real ideas, real conversations. Subscribe to Future of Freedom wherever you get your podcasts. That's Future of Freedom. And now, back to the recent interview. Talk about how they get out of Algeria, and then they ultimately split up. And Leary comes above ground, but Rosemary is underground for over 2 decades.
Yes, yeah. So eventually they were able to convince Eldridge to pass along their fake passport so that they could attend a lecture in Copenhagen. It ended up being kind of a front. They were going to be arrested in Copenhagen, and they get word from a mutual friend that the cops are already there. So they go undercover in Switzerland, a neutral country. And there again, they get kind of aid from a very shady character, an arms dealer named Michel Hachard. And Hachard really wants to get his hands on Timothy Leary's book in progress about his prison escape, and manages to orchestrate another arrest of Timothy Leary, leaving Rosemary once again in the role of the kind of media heroine, the face of the movement. She has to raise money for Timothy, and she's just exasperated by then. When they're with the Panthers, they're at their closest because they only had each other. But she saw him as very pathetic, a pathetic figure. He was frightened. He was cowed by the experience. He looked old. She was really she pitied him in a lot of ways. And that was their dynamic, where she always would say, like, that was something that called to her, like taking care of him. But once in Switzerland and among the kind of jet setters there and the socialites, I love her detail about talking about, the price of shipping priceless art overseas and, allowing their dog to eat off their plates at the table. Like, that was the kind of, vibe that she was in. And she saw what she said was the limits of his mind. And at that point, she couldn't unsee it. And once she got him released from prison again, she left him. Right. And that became the schism between them at that point.
Leary's, kind of next few years are well known, including him ultimately being arrested
Yes.
and then, cutting a deal. He argues that he did not name anybody who wasn't already known and things like that. But
Well, he did name Rose. I mean, he
Yeah.
said, right. Yeah.
so, explain that, because this is, part of what's the pathos of the book is that Rosemary gets simultaneously erased from the history, but also she ends up having like all of these legal charges against her.
So she becomes the target. So what happens is Timothy is arrested in Afghanistan with his new perfect love, Joanna Leary. It's his words. And Rosemary they know that Rosemary is a kind of, she would call herself the computer. She had all the information. Timothy Leary was giving up the information, but Timothy Leary alone on the stand wasn't going to hold water. They needed Rosemary, and Timothy was very ready to give her up. He decoded all the letters to the FBI. He gave up all the people who were involved, and he even tried to bribe her mother to get her whereabouts so that he could cut a better deal for himself. And Rosemary refused to cooperate. And she went further underground, first going deeper into Europe, in Sicily, and then ending up in South and Central America, where she lived for about 3 years. But throughout this whole time, she refused. There were opportunities for her to come forward, but she was scared, really, of jail and prison. She had done some jail time earlier when she would again not speak against Timothy when she was in contempt of court back in Millbrook when they were investigating the house, and she didn't want to do that. But she also had a great sense of integrity and pride in her own sense of morality and justice that I think was lacking in Leary.
Explain how she eventually comes back above ground, and how does she spend her life? She died in 2002 at the age of 66. Leary had died a few years before that, and they had reconciled. We'll get to that in a second. But how does she come back above ground? Because this is also, these stories are all played out now, but there was a moment, starting, I guess, in the 70s through the 80s and 90s, et cetera, where 60s radicals kind of would come back. Yes. They would float back to the surface.
Yes. And she watched it. I have all the clippings of the people that she was watching. And, it would always interested me in why she stayed so long. So she ends up, it's an apocryphal story, but she claims that she water skied back into the country in 1976 on a drug smuggling boat. I don't think that was true, but more power to her. I love her. But she ended up coming back via Florida and ended up going all the way up to Cape Cod, where she lived for 23 years, running a bed and breakfast or a kind of hotel at the kind of edge of the world in Provincetown, Cape Cod. And there's where she lived under an assumed name. Very few people knew her story. And she lived a very simple, quiet life. Until she got word of Timothy Leary's daughter's suicide. And that kind of opened up all the spigots that she had closed about all the emotion she felt for Timothy. And at that point, she made contact with him again because she was very fearful of making contact with him. She was scared of him. She was scared of what he could do to her reputation, what he could do to her legally. And I think she was also tired and kind of resentful of the mythology that she had helped create.
Right. So how did legally she came back, and she didn't serve any time, right?
She paid $1,000 and $1,080, which was a very 108 is a very important number, and she felt very kind of vindicated by that. But she was able to kind of convince the judge that she was a not a threat, and B, that she was kind of overtaken by this guru, Timothy Leary. And he bought it, and she hated saying it. Right. Her close friend, David Phillips, who was with her during this time, said, I think there was a little bit grain of truth about that. And she wouldn't admit that it was true.
It's kind of fascinating, the number of people, and, she was on the FBI's most wanted list, et cetera, for years. And then when they resurface, and it's like, all right, you can just go back out into the general population. And even people like Bernadine Dorn, who I find despicable and risible from a political point of view, like in the end, she really didn't have to pay anything. Like you come back, Abby Hoffman,
even Eldridge Cleaver, who I think he was arrested for murder.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting that there's and particularly around the 60s and, with Leary, especially the whole kind of war on drugs, Nixon zeroed in on him as the most dangerous man in America. And then it's kind of like, okay, it's not that big
and then
a deal.
he's like your friendly, on the night shows and, but kind of, his power it was interesting because he had this vision.
Yeah.
First time he did acid, people who know who Michael Hollingshead is, the first time he did acid was with that kind of British, like another trickster. And he had a vision of himself as a clown. And that's kind of where he ended up, at least in the 80s. I think he really it kind of became that terrible. It was a terrible image for him, and he was really affected by it. And he became that, and he became that in the culture too. And it was in the 90s, I think, that changed a bit because of the internet.
He was simpatico with a kind of burgeoning internet world and techno-optimism, and he started talking about kind of personal computers and the internet were the new acid.
Yes, exactly. And for all the things, people do like to kind of speak ill of Timothy Leary, and it's easy to do that once you know some of parts of his biography, but he was very prescient. He saw a lot of the things coming that we take for granted, and he would say things like, oh, I'm going to get my brain uploaded to the internet, and people laughed, or there's going to be a whole, departments in major universities dedicated to the study of psychedelics.
Right.
And it's like, he saw a lot of the future, which you can't discount.
How did she reconcile with him? Because, Timothy Leary treated a lot of people badly, particularly women who he married.
Yeah.
And she arguably worse than any of them.
Yes.
How did she reconcile with him?
I think, she said, I was mated to him. And that to her was like, as much as they were in many ways not well suited for each other temperamentally, she felt that he was her soulmate. I think it was kind of that simple. But I also think that she saw the loss of his daughter. I think that she took some blame of it on herself. And I think she had a sense of what that loss meant to him. And I think maybe there's this, there is a heart opening that can happen with long-term psychedelic use. And I think she was representative of that.
Yeah, can you, in a way, I think one great thing about the book is if you've read a lot about the 60s counterculture, including the way it moves into the 70s, this is just a different perspective because it's by a major participant whose eyes you haven't seen through before. From a contemporary point of view, it is hard to get past the sexism, which is everywhere, all the time. How do you tease? What is the message that you might bring to a contemporary, boy or girl reading this? In terms of how do you factor that in? Because she, in the end, she was giving after Leary died. She had annual parties, where she would give away parts of his ashes with glitter in it, so that when you throw it up in the air,
it's true. I saw.
She remained committed to the bit, kind of, even though she was part of a system that treated her so poorly.
I think she believed in him, and I think in many ways she believed in some of his mission, not the kind of vast evangelical kind of promotion of psychedelics that he was championing, but I think she did believe in that. I think the thing I hope people take away from it is that she was complicated, and she doesn't kind of fit into these ideas of what a woman should be or how she should use her power. No, she was more like all of us who are complicated, and we sometimes pick people who aren't great for us, or we love people who are damaged and damaging, and that doesn't make her any less worthy of a biography. I think it makes her really exciting. As a biographer, that's very exciting to me.
Well, it is, again, it's a dimension that just I have not encountered in this way before. So I think it's a huge contribution to kind of discussions of the psychedelic movement, but also just more broadly the counterculture. Let's talk about how it connects with your other work. Your first book, which was a cultural phenomenon, was Brain on Fire, which was about how you contracted a form of encephalitis and you were, days away from kind of being locked up in a mental institution for the rest of your life when a doctor realized that what you had and that it could be treated not through psychiatry, but through medical interventions. Your other book, and this is the first one of yours that I read, was The Great Pretender from 2019, which is about David Rosenhan, who was at Swarthmore at the time, an academic psychologist, who in 1973 published a paper called Being Sane in Insane Places, which was a stunning, takedown of mental institutions in America. And you reveal it to be an utter fraud. What is the continuity between, those two books and this book?
In some ways, I think of it as like they are very closely aligned in my mind. I mean, just in terms of very concretely, I talk about psychedelics in all three of the books. Obviously, the most in Acid Queen, but in the first book, in Brain on Fire, I talk about ketamine, the same receptor of the brain that was affected by my immune system targeting my brain is also the target of ketamine. And in my second book, I talked about Humphrey Osmond and the use of LSD he actually insisted that his architect take LSD to try to understand what it's like to go mad. So that was when it was a psychotomimetic, understanding madness. I'm interested in altered states. I think consciousness, I think the way that our brain, mind shapes reality is fascinating to me. Obviously, psychedelics has a lot to do with that. But we were kind of talking before, and I think there is something to the concepts of like the ideas of kind of institutions and how that shapes, the kind of role of labeling and the real world implications of the role of institutions in kind of like an everyday person's reality, if that makes sense.
Right. So can we, just to linger on that a little bit, particularly think about The Great Pretender and David Rosenhan, who is one of the great critics of mental institutions and labeling. And basically what he was arguing in this paper where he had pseudo-patients show up at mental institutions describing vague symptoms was that because of the context, they would be labeled mad.
Everything
and then
they did
would be
subsequently.
mad. Yeah. How, is he wrong even though he totally faked his data?
Here's the deal with that, which was, and I think this also does connect to Rosemary in this idea of being complicated, and this story is obviously more nuanced, which I'm fascinated by, is that he was right about so many things in that paper. And it wasn't fully fabricated. He had his own experience. There was one they were called pseudo-patients, people wanted to cover, who I was able to find with some issues. Totally flawed study, but one that also had a lot of truth to it. So it's hard to wrap your head around the idea that something that could be made up.
So this is like when people say, well, OJ was guilty, but the LAPD framed him.
Right.
It's like one of these weird scenarios.
Right, they can both be true at the same time.
In terms of the labeling question, like we now live in a golden age of labeling, both by institutions and psychologists and medical experts and ourselves, where, people, I don't know how many times I've talked to people who are like, I'm on the autism spectrum, I self-diagnosed. I mean, how should we orient ourselves towards labeling? Should we be more free with them? Should we be more careful? Should we be more suspect of them?
I'm personally, I'm someone who's very circumspect about labeling, especially if it's an institution doing that labeling, because as we know from the history of science and medicine, things shift all the time in terms of how labels are viewed, how they're, even given services or how they're treated. And so I'm always a little bit hesitant. However, a label saved my life. I got the right diagnosis at the right time. And without that, I wouldn't be here today. So again, it's nuanced and it's complicated. And I think that there can be great work there and very bad work there too.
It seems to me, and I'm teasing out a libertarian message in your work, but it's that labels that are totalizing or institutions that are totalizing are problematic because all of our knowledge is provisional and contingent, and it's going to change both with new information and perspective and experience.
Right. Like the DSM is a working document. It was meant to be something that was supposed to change over time, but it's been, as they say, reified. It's been concrete. It's made concrete in a way that it wasn't meant to.
Yeah.
And that can happen with labels as well.
Right. And that's a particular, I guess, both in Brain on Fire and The Great Pretender, that's part of the negative outcome is that you talk about how therapists in particular now just kind of do checklists rather than have a basic conversation with people. And you miss a lot of information, even as that other approach might allow things to scale.
Seeing the humanity in another person, even if there is a hierarchy in terms of the being a clinician and being the patient. yeah, and I think I do, to bring it back to Rosemary,
Yeah,
not to like make it, but there is a hierarchical imbalance between the person who is guiding and the guided. And that's something I'm very interested in as well.
What's your favorite psychedelic?
I'm not a psychonaut.
Yeah. You've never tripped?
I've done mushrooms. That's a limit of my experience.
Okay.
I'm not.
Did you like them?
I did.
What did you like about them?
I saw dancing Grateful Dead bears, which is the lamest thing to see. I love Grateful Dead, don't get me wrong, but it's so on the nose. Yeah, exactly.
It
was so unexciting. But no, I did actually have that unity consciousness experience, which I actually
explain that.
I had this feeling that we were all connected, and I felt very good about that. And I had that again, not taking psychedelics. I had that after the birth of my twins. And I remember just like talking about it. It fills me with, they were in the back of my car. We were driving from the Upper East Side. And there were these like two pink souls in the back of my car. And I remember looking out at the street, and it was cold. It was in January, and everyone kind of had their collars up, and I was like, everyone's been born, and it was like this bizarre, like, I couldn't I still I mean, that was like, it was kind of both beautiful but terrifying. And I feel like that's a psychedelic experience.
All right. Susannah Cahalan, author most recently of The Acid Queen.